They labeled it a truce, a pause in the bloodletting, and for a fleeting moment after the public declaration, the world allowed itself a shallow breath. Financial markets leaped, the price of crude shuddered downward, and a crowd swelled in Thrawn's Enkab Square, clutching phones and candles. The vocabulary of resolution saturated every broadcast. Truce, accord, triumph. Leaders from the chancelleries of Riyadh to the government quarters of Berlin rushed to issue congratulatory notes. Social media timelines turned into oceans of relieved emojis and hopeful think pieces. For about 2 full days, humanity exhaled. Then the Israeli military machine turned its weight back onto Lebanon. Tehran, in turn, warned once more of shutting the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow chokehold through which a fifth of the planet's oil normally flows. The Iranian parliamentary speaker, in a televised address, accused Washington of tearing up 3 separate articles of the unwritten agreement before any formal negotiation had even been inaugurated. Pakistan, the unexpected broker that had pulled the rivals to the table, publicly documented violations of the supposed ceasefire and implored all parties to show restraint. The White House pushed back, insisting the strait had never been reclosed. Yet, Lloyd's List, the Maritime Intelligence Authority, quietly reported that in the 24 hours after the truce was announced, a mere 3 vessels had traversed that waterway, 3 ships through the passage that ordinarily carries 1/5 of global oil supplies. That anomaly is the real story, the one buried beneath the avalanche of handshake diplomacy, the truth social boasts, and the elegantly crafted statements from foreign ministries. The headline-grabbing ceasefire is not the tale. What the ceasefire omits, fails to resolve, and refuses to confront is the true drama. The structural engine of this war remains utterly intact, even as both camps claim a version of victory. To understand where this conflict is genuinely heading, you must look past the press releases and into the chasm between public announcement and geopolitical reality, a gap far wider than any headline can convey. Let us begin where the ceasefire narrative begins, with what was actually said, or rather, what was not written down. On the 7th of April 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a provisional 2-week halt of all military operations. The announcement landed fewer than 2 hours before a deadline President Trump had imposed on Tehran, a deadline he had underscored by threatening in stark language to erase a whole civilization if Iran refused to bend. The deal was not hammered out in Oman or Qatar, the traditional backchannels of U.S.-Iran diplomacy, but in Islamabad, under Pakistani stewardship. Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, the military chief, received credit from multiple governments for stitching the arrangement together. Iran put forward a 10-point proposal. Washington termed it a workable foundation for dialogue. Trump broke the news on Truth Social. No formal treaty was signed. No official text saw daylight. The 2 most formidable adversaries in the modern Middle East agreed to stop shooting at each other based on a social media post and competing public statements that contradicted each other within hours. That is not exaggeration. It is the documented historical record. And it matters enormously because, in the vacuum left by the absence of a signed document, each side has been rushing to fill the void with its own interpretation of what the pause covers, what it excludes, and what it obligates. The result, in the words of a senior analyst at King's College London, is a very ambiguous ceasefire agreement that is extremely shaky and brittle. Those are not the musings of a television pundit seeking airtime. They are the considered judgment of a professional who studies such arrangements. That brittleness is the premise on which everything that follows rests. Now we must reconstruct the timeline that led to this precarious moment, because this truce did not materialize from thin air. It is the offspring of a chain of decisions, miscalculations, and strategic gambles stretching back over a year. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury by Washington and Operation Roaring Lion by Tel Aviv. The opening salvo involved nearly 900 strikes within 12 hours. B-2 stealth bombers, B-1 Lancers, and B-52 Stratofortresses pummeled fortified underground installations. U.S. warships fired Tomahawk cruise missiles. Israeli jets executed what officials described as unprecedented decapitation strikes. In the initial hours of the operation, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, targeted at his residential compound along with senior advisors and family members. Dozens of other Iranian officials perished in the same strike package. The campaign had 4 stated military objectives: destroy Iran's ballistic missile program and infrastructure, eliminate its nuclear weapons capability, degrade its proxy networks across the region, and annihilate its navy. A 5th objective, regime change, was never formally declared, but most serious analysts believe it was the animating logic of the entire enterprise. Trump himself framed the strikes as potentially weakening the regime enough to facilitate its internal collapse. What happened instead was a 40-day regional war. Iran retaliated with hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles directed at Israel, at American military bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, and Iraq, and at energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates went up in flames. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed, a blockade that the International Energy Agency described as the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history, cutting off up to 20 million barrels of oil per day from global markets. Brent crude climbed above $114 per barrel, a level unseen since the early years of the COVID pandemic. Fuel rationing began in parts of Southeast Asia. Commercial shipping rerouted thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk the strait. Iranian proxy forces in Iraq fired over 23 drone strikes at U.S. assets in Erbil alone. Lebanon became another front as Israeli forces expanded operations against Hezbollah. By the time Pakistan began mediating in early April, over 2,000 Iranians had been killed, 13 American service members were dead, and 19 Israelis had perished from Iranian strikes and drones. This is the war that produced a ceasefire. Keep that picture in your mind, because the scale and devastation are precisely what make the current pause so deceptive. After fighting at that intensity for 40 days, stopping is not the same as winning, and stopping without resolving anything is not the same as peace. So what does the ceasefire actually contain, given that no official text exists? From public statements and diplomatic leaks, we know this. Washington agreed to suspend U.S. military strikes on Iran for an initial 2-week period. Iran agreed to cease its defensive operations for the same window, conditional on both American and Israeli strikes stopping. Iran also agreed to coordinate safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz during the ceasefire period, a commitment that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi qualified almost immediately by referencing unspecified technical limitations. Within 24 hours of that announcement, Iran and Oman were reportedly discussing plans to charge transit fees on vessels passing through the strait, with funds earmarked for reconstruction. The White House denied the strait had been closed again. Lloyd's List said 3 ships had gotten through. Iran's parliamentary speaker insisted the United States had already violated 3 clauses before talks had even begun. That is the ceasefire in full. Now let us talk about what is not in it. There is no agreement on Iran's nuclear program. The full 10-point Iranian proposal and the 15-point American counterproposal have not been made public. What we know from reporting is that Tehran's demands include recognition of Iran's right to uranium enrichment, lifting of all sanctions, and reconstruction assistance. Washington's demands reportedly include a permanent end to all uranium enrichment, the transfer of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile out of the country, limits on Iran's ballistic missile program, and the dissolution of its regional proxy networks. These positions are not close. They are not even in the same strategic universe. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated publicly that the U.S. plan makes clear Iran can never have nuclear weapons. Iran has made equally clear that its missile program and its right to enrich are non-negotiable. Trump himself said there will be no enrichment. Iran's foreign minister said, "Enrichment is not going to be given up. Both things cannot be true simultaneously. Both are the stated positions of the parties sitting down to negotiate in Islamabad. There is also no agreement covering Lebanon. This single point nearly unraveled the ceasefire before the ink was dry." Pakistan's prime minister said Lebanon was part of the deal. Iran said Lebanon was covered. The United States made no mention of Lebanon in its ceasefire statement. Israel said it would not stop its operations against Hezbollah under any circumstances. Within hours of the ceasefire announcement, Israel launched what it described as its largest strikes on Beirut since the beginning of the war. Iran responded by threatening to resume operations. The Iranian parliamentary speaker cited the Lebanon strikes as the first American violation of the 10-point framework. The ceasefire was declared on April 7th. By April 8th, it was already breaking down along lines that anyone who read the agreement carefully could have predicted. Why does this vocabulary problem matter so much? The word ceasefire carries enormous political weight. It signals to financial markets that the risk premium is coming off. It signals to domestic audiences in both countries that their side achieved something. It signals to the international community that diplomacy is working. But the word only does that work if the parties to the agreement are describing the same thing. In this case, they demonstrably are not. Trump called it a total and complete victory. Iran's Supreme National Security Council called it an enduring defeat for Washington. Pakistan's prime minister called it a fragile truce. Vice President Vance, in a rare moment of candor, called it exactly what it is, a fragile truce. These are not stylistic differences. They reflect fundamentally incompatible understandings of what was agreed and who conceded what. What is also missing from most coverage is this: the military picture has not materially changed. As of the ceasefire announcement, the United States still had approximately 50,000 service members deployed in and around the Middle East. CENTCOM reported that American forces had struck over 10,000 targets inside Iran since February 28th. Missile sites, drone facilities, naval assets, command and control infrastructure, and military-industrial facilities. Iran's formal navy has been severely degraded. Multiple senior IRGC commanders have been killed. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the man killed in the opening strikes, has publicly stated that Iran is prepared to sustain offensive operations indefinitely. He said that before the ceasefire. He has not publicly walked it back since. Critically, a preliminary assessment from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that Iran moved significant portions of its enriched uranium stockpile before the American strikes began, and that the underground nuclear facilities were not collapsed. That assessment suggested Iran's nuclear timeline had been set back by months, not years. The CIA director pushed back, claiming severe damage that would require years to rebuild. But here is the strategic reality embedded in that dispute. Both agencies agree that Iran's nuclear program was not eliminated. The program exists. The material may have survived. And the new leadership in Tehran has publicly signaled it may withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entirely. Diplomats noted that Iran's own foreign minister and senior officials had already flagged this possibility after the June 2025 12-day war. A government signaling NPT withdrawal is not moving toward nuclear disarmament. It is keeping its options open. There is one actor in this picture that neither side is discussing publicly, one whose next move may determine whether this ceasefire holds for 6 months or collapses in 6 weeks. That unnamed actor is Benjamin Netanyahu. Understanding his role is not a peripheral detail. It is the central mechanism through which this pause either survives or dies. Netanyahu spoke publicly within hours of the ceasefire announcement. He said the truce was not the end of the campaign against Iran, but a station on the way to achieving all of our goals. He said Israel would continue to strike Lebanon. He said the ceasefire does not bind Israel in Lebanon. Then Israeli jets did exactly what he promised, hitting more than 100 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon on the same day the ceasefire was declared, killing at least 254 people in what Lebanese authorities called the deadliest single day since the war began. This was not a rogue military action. It was policy announced publicly by a sitting prime minister, executed in real time. The strategic logic underneath that decision is cold and calculated. Netanyahu faces a domestic election later this year. His corruption trial, charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, has restarted in Israeli courts. He has historically benefited politically from active military conflict, and analysts across the spectrum note that his calculation is less about strategic necessity and more about political survival. More critically, he has identified that the Islamabad negotiations, the talks after the ceasefire, will either be converted into something durable or exposed as theater, will proceed without Israeli participation. Israel is not at the table. Whatever Washington and Tehran agree to in Pakistan will be presented to Netanyahu as a fait accompli. That is a situation he has every incentive to prevent by keeping the pressure on, keeping the conflict alive, and keeping Lebanon as an active front that Iran cannot ignore. Vice President Vance, speaking from Budapest, said it would be dumb for Iran to jeopardize the negotiations over Lebanon. But here's the problem with that framing. Iran does not view Lebanon as a separate issue. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, its foreign minister, and its parliamentary speaker have all stated explicitly that Lebanon is an inseparable part of the ceasefire. When Iran's deputy foreign minister told reporters that Tehran was on the verge of responding to ceasefire violations and was only pulled back by Pakistani diplomatic intervention, that was not rhetoric. That was a near resumption of active hostilities within 48 hours of the ceasefire taking effect. Pakistan reportedly conveyed messages from the United States promising to control Israel. Whether Washington can actually deliver on that promise is the question that will determine everything in the next 2 weeks. Let me make that simple. The United States brokered a ceasefire with Iran. Its closest regional ally is violating the terms of that ceasefire as understood by the mediating country, by Iran, by Lebanon, by the European Union, and by virtually every government in the world except Washington and Tel Aviv. Trump told Netanyahu to low-key it. That is the diplomatic infrastructure on which a durable settlement is supposed to be built. And the former Israeli ambassador to the United States has now publicly acknowledged that Israel and Washington are not even aligned on priorities. Israel is focused on recovering Iran's buried nuclear stockpile. Washington is focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz to prevent a global economic catastrophe. Two allies, two ceasefires, one table in Islamabad where neither has actually sat down yet. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. Even if Lebanon resolves, even if Netanyahu walks back the strikes, even if Iran stays at the table, even if the Islamabad talks begin on schedule, the underlying gap between Iranian and American positions on the core issues has not narrowed by a single percentage point. Iran's 10-point proposal demands recognition of its right to enrich uranium. The U.S. 15-point proposal demands a permanent end to all enrichment. Iran wants sanctions lifted as a precondition for progress. Washington considers sanctions relief the reward for verifiable compliance. Iran wants a binding UN Security Council resolution to lock any agreement into international law, a direct response to the trauma of 2018 when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA. Washington has shown no appetite for subjecting itself to that kind of multilateral constraint. Here's what that means in plain terms. The 2015 nuclear deal took years of sustained diplomatic effort, full P5+1 engagement, and an American administration actively seeking a legacy agreement. It still collapsed in 3 years. What is being proposed in Islamabad is a bilateral negotiation with no multilateral framework, with no signed text as a starting point, with competing public interpretations of the ceasefire that is supposed to enable the negotiation, with an Israeli prime minister actively working against the process, and with a 2-week deadline. 2 weeks to solve what diplomats could not solve in a decade. This is not pessimism, this is arithmetic. So here is what to watch, because if you have stayed with me this far, you deserve a framework for reading what comes next. First, watch the Strait of Hormuz traffic data, not the statements. Iran's Revolutionary Guards issued a maritime warning directing ships to alternative routes, citing sea mines in the main transit corridor. As of Thursday morning, marine traffic through the strait was at its lowest level since late March. Official statements claim the strait is open. Real-world shipping behavior tells a different story. When those two things diverge, the shipping data is the more reliable signal. Second, watch what Washington does or does not do about Lebanon. Trump told Netanyahu to keep it quiet. Netanyahu's chief foreign policy advisor said publicly that Trump and Netanyahu are in complete agreement and praised the scale of the Beirut strikes. If the United States cannot or will not deliver restraint from Israel on Lebanon, Iran will treat that as confirmation that the ceasefire was never real. Iran's president has already put it on record. If Israeli attacks continue, negotiations will be meaningless. Iran's hands remain on the trigger. Third, watch the enrichment question. The White House stated after the ceasefire that Iran's enrichment program would end, a condition Iran has categorically rejected as non-negotiable. The Iranian parliamentary speaker cited precisely that statement as one of 3 American violations before talks had even begun. This issue is not a bargaining chip. For Iran, the right to enrich is existential. It is the sovereign technology that gives Tehran strategic leverage in every future negotiation. Asking Iran to surrender it is not a negotiating position. It is a demand for unconditional surrender dressed in diplomatic language. Let me give you the 3 scenarios clearly, so you can assess which one you are watching unfold in real time. The first scenario is that the ceasefire holds. Pakistan successfully manages the Lebanon dispute. The Islamabad talks begin, and the 2 weeks are extended by mutual agreement. Negotiations grind forward on a partial deal, limited sanctions relief in exchange for enrichment caps, and enhanced monitoring. This is the scenario that markets are currently pricing. It is also the scenario that requires the most things to go right simultaneously. Netanyahu restrains himself. Iran accepts ambiguity on enrichment. The United States accepts something short of complete Iranian nuclear surrender, and no third-party incident derails the process. Each of those conditions is individually uncertain. All of them holding together simultaneously is a low probability outcome. The second scenario is a quiet collapse. The Lebanon fighting continues at reduced intensity. Iran concludes that the ceasefire is being used to rearm and reposition, not to negotiate seriously. The Islamabad talks begin, but produce no framework agreement within the 2-week window. The ceasefire lapses without formal renewal. Proxy escalation resumes incrementally across Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. Neither side formally declares the ceasefire over. The world slides back into low-grade regional war without a single dramatic moment to mark the transition. This is historically the most common outcome of ceasefires that lack a signed text and a clear arbitration mechanism. It is right now the most probable scenario. The third scenario is the one that produces the most severe global consequences. An Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear material, on an IRGC commander, or on a Hezbollah weapons depot in Lebanon crosses a threshold that Iran cannot absorb politically under its new leadership. Iran responds directly. The United States is forced to choose in real time whether to defend its ally or protect the negotiating process it has staked its credibility on. If it defends Israel, the ceasefire dies and the war resumes at higher intensity than before. If it does not, the U.S.-Israel alliance enters the worst crisis in its history. Netanyahu has already handed Trump that choice once. He has every incentive to hand it to him again. Here is what I want you to take from this analysis. A ceasefire is not a settlement. It is a pause. And a pause without a structural agreement is a timeline, a countdown to the next escalation, the next missed deadline, the next public statement that contradicts the one made 6 hours before. What is unfolding right now in the U.S.-Iran conflict is not a peace process. It is a pressure management exercise. And pressure, when it has nowhere to go, does not dissipate, it builds. The Strait of Hormuz carries 1/5 of the world's oil. Brent crude is still above $100 a barrel. The Defense Intelligence Agency's preliminary assessment says Iran's nuclear program was set back by months, not years. The new supreme leader has publicly said Iran will fight indefinitely. Pakistan is managing a ceasefire that its own prime minister says is being violated. And Benjamin Netanyahu has told his country on camera that this war is not over. This story is not ending with today's headline.